what we're going to be covering tonight is just the first of these three major topics to do with what the very foundations of the economy is. We've got the theory of property, then we're going to be looking at price, and then we're going to be looking at money. And so understanding property is really our first start. And so that's what's going to occupy us here. In fact, to really kind of go through it and get a real feel for it, it's probably going to take us maybe even 2 nights to kind of go through as much as I'd like. Because one of the problems with property is that it's something which we're surrounded with from, before we can walk. And so we think that it just comes out of the ark as something natural. And more than that, especially in our culture, we're sort of sensitized to talking about property because many of us, I'd say most of us, are kind of, I won't say afraid, but cautious that if I challenge the question of property, I'm actually a closet communist. Okay? Because now, most of the time, we're sort of thinking, well, the church has always opposed communism, and communism doesn't work, it's a bad and evil thing, right? And all of those things are quite true. And communists don't believe in property, so that means that we do believe in property, and so, hey, what are you talking about it for? Because that sounds like you don't really believe in it. And so you're trying to, sneak in sort of underneath my guard and turn me into a communist, right? Now, and that's kind of this caution that we've got. On the other hand, if I had some of my, I won't say I have too much now, but some of my former university colleagues to come in and say, well, property is a natural right or something, and they're kind of really left-wingers. They say, oh, well, you're in, blah, blah, blah. So property is controversial, but it's also one of these sensitivities. And so what we need to do is approach it fairly delicately and see what we can understand about property from its very nature. Let's look at, some of these issues. Problem of property. We started off by talking, before we actually got this started, about the way that our economic relations are all based on the exchange of material things. Okay? And that's because we're not doing that just for fun. We're doing it because we're body and soul, and we need material things in order to survive and flourish. And to the extent that at some point we'll be looking at the way we're going to look at wealth and we're going to look at goods. And when we do that, we're going to look at the concept of good as opposed to the moral concept of good, but the material concept of good is something that contributes to our quality of life, to our flourishing as human persons. So it keeps our body alive. So our material side is something not to be shunned. It's an important part of us, and it's a key part of so many of our relationships. And so we can say it's a necessity for life. Although the big problem with property, and especially now we're going to be looking at land property, is that it's not naturally owned. So we're going to say, yes, we stand by private property. But now I'm going to start off by saying, well, hang on. But if I look at a piece of land, I'm not actually connected to it. I can talk about my fingers. They can't be yours. They're connected to me. They're something that I popped into the world with. Right? So what are the things that I have when I'm born? Well, naturally, I come into the world with fingers and toes and eyes and a head and all that sort of carry on. So they're part of me. I can say that there are some other things that are part of me. There's my intellect, my life. They're things which are naturally a part of me. If you take those away from me, naturally you do some violence to me. However, I own a block of land, or somebody owns a block of land. How is that connected to me? Now, if we're standing by private property, we've then got this problem because we can see that there is natural property, which is our fingers and toes, but then there's this other property, which often is far more important. I don't tend to get into a lot of arguments over the ownership of my fingers and toes. However, look at the law courts. In fact, we've even got a special law court in every state of Australia, I think most states of Australia, called the Land and Environment Court, which is specifically to do with nothing apart from people having barneys over land property. And if you look at a lot of other civil law, it's also property rights happen, as a fairly prominent issue. So we've got the problem that's not naturally owned. Because the land, like we're living on a piece of land or occupying a piece of land right now, or might have a piece of land we're using as a farm, it has the potential to help our economic relationships. It becomes the farm where I grow things, the mine where I dig things out of the ground, the workshop or the factory where I turn things into more appropriate products, right? Or maybe the shop where I sell them, or the house where I live. All of these things are very good and healthy. So property, naturally, this is external property that right now I'm saying we don't have a natural connection with, mighty, mighty important for our life. And so it's a good thing. And I've said that a good is something which contributes to the quality of my life. However, it can also be a bad thing, because one way or another, it represents a form of power if I can control it. If I can control the land that you occupy, if I'm benevolent to you in some way, or even just fair and just, then you get to benefit from it. Maybe I get to benefit from somewhere. You might be my tenant, I might be leasing it to you. But I can equally use it in an exploitative way. So when we talk about, Sydney and Melbourne, perhaps being in the middle of a property bubble. Land values are too high. People can't live anymore. Well, okay, you sort of stand it, and as we go along, hopefully we'll get a bit more of a moral sense of whether that's a valid thing to say or not, or is it just an expression of stupid emotion? Are prices really too high or not? Okay. What we're seeing is that one way or another, the people coming into the property market are kind of the victims, perhaps, of exploitation. And there have been times in the past in different places where that's certainly been apparent. And it's been said that, for instance, if you look at the people that grew most wealthy through the English Industrial Revolution, most of the history books paint it in terms of the factory owners and the managers of the factories and the entrepreneurs and that sort of carry on. In fact, the real winners were the landowners, the people who owned the land underneath the factories. Because as the factories became more productive, the landowners just put up the rent. And the poor old factory operators, they had to go and sort of charge higher prices for the community and give their workers less wages. And before you know it, all the ordinary people in England were really, really poor. Was it because of these dreadful factory owners? Actually, it wasn't. It had to do with land rents being far too high. And there are a number of other ways where we can see land being used as a form of exploitation, for exploiting tenants. Again, I don't want to go too far because, again, this is a very delicate issue. I don't want to look like a socialist, because this is the kind of language that socialists are very, very comfortable with. But I do want to say perhaps there is an issue there that we need to sort of think about. And at this stage it's sufficient to simply say property rights can potentially be exploitative because they're important to us. We're weak without them. We kind of need them. We were talking about when we come into the world? Come into the world and I've got my fingers and toes, don't I? Right? I've got my intellect, I've got my life. However, right from the word go, I need to be able to use things which are not connected to me. Like air. Air is a form of external material thing which is important for my life. If I no air, no life. So if I'm denied access to air, I lose something which is naturally mine, which is my life. So if there was some way of commodifying and maybe privatising air, potentially the person who owned that property right could have the capacity really over life or death. Right? And so the conventional property right of controlling air, that might be an absurd thing in a way, could then move into violating the natural right that I have to life. You see how we've got kind of some delicate things coming in here? Now, air is again pretty extreme, and we don't charge it because, in a sense, it is free. Oddly enough, in the environmental economics world, we're starting to look at prices on air. Not as though we privately own it entirely, but we're looking at ways of pricing pollution. And what we're saying is that shall we allow people to so pollute the air that certain places become toxic? Now, this is only at its infancy, but my point is that it's a private property right which right now is slowly kind of crystallising out of the fog, out of the common domain. And at some point in the future, there will be people who might be exploring that question of how far can we take that. We've certainly done it with land. We're doing it with water right now. We're doing it with biota, like vegetation in the natural area. And for my sins, it's something that I've had to have a fair bit to do with, especially water property and biota, carbon property. And we've had the ups and downs of carbon property with carbon tax and all that sort of stuff. So these property rights are coming in, and they do have the effect to really change the balance of the standard of living of different people. The last point there is I'm saying that property has the capacity to concentrate economic power. And in some ways, property is one of the most important control levers of economic power. If I own a lot of property, I own a lot of economic power. I might own a lot of money, might own a lot of other things, maybe license rights. I might be Mr. McDonald and I kind of give you a franchise to open a McDonald's store. That's a kind of property right, and it gives me economic power. But one of the most apparent easy ones is land property. Yeah? But then we're still sitting on the problem that land property is, we don't have an actual tie to it. And so we have to ask this question: on what basis is land ownership justified? Okay. Now, there's an answer to it, but it's a little bit more subtle than it first appears. Later on, we're going to be coming into this balance of return to the different factors. I won't go into that here. I do want to, though, talk about the idea of natural rights or natural connections and conventional connections, if you like, or conventional principles. A convention is nothing more than a positive human social construct. So what I'm saying there is that when I'm talking about like a natural thing, like my fingers and toes being mine, that's natural. That's a part of the way things are. It's the way I cannot be without having those things, at least in the normal case. However, when I'm talking about a convention, it means simply an arbitrary rule of a game. And it might be done just for fun. So I might be playing soccer one day, rugby the next, and so or basketball. I might be playing with the same shaped ball. The rules are different because basketball, you use little hoops to throw through, and soccer you're doing something else. Okay, and probably if you guys play those games, you probably say, oh no, basketballs are actually a completely different creature. But simply from a distance, you say, what's the difference? The difference is the arbitrary set of rules, the conventions. Now, when you're looking at conventions, the question of their effectiveness becomes important. So we might want to play our soccer. We might decide, for whatever reason, we might break bones whenever we play soccer, and so we might change to basketball. And when we look at basketball, we might change the rules between netball and basketball or something. Right? But we can then look at it and say, well, what are our standards? Well, I like playing netball because it does such and such better. Or I prefer soccer because it does such and such other better. Right? So we can grade them and relate them. The point here is that when we're dealing with conventions, it's not one size fits all. That's not to say that there's no right or wrong, but what it does say is that we can test the principles that we're using whenever we've got conventions in place, and by and large conventions, especially when they're dealing with human relationships and therefore with moral issues, we can test them against kind of ultimately moral standards. And I've already hinted at that conventions are fundamentally ethical. Well, conventions when it comes to things like, rules for appropriate behaviour. Okay, those arbitrary rules, like driving on the left-hand side of the road and stuff like that. And we can, so we're getting into ethical debate. And this leads on to recognition, which right now in economics is a very uncomfortable one. Very few economists accept the idea that economics and ethics or moral philosophy has any overlap. Right? Until the 20th century, economics was always taught as a sub-discipline, a specialisation within moral philosophy. Around a century ago, 120 years ago, that was lost. Okay? And as we go along, we're going to have to rebuild a good understanding of why economics is a sub-discipline of morals. But there are many, many economists, and unfortunately an awful lot of them, go to Mass on Sundays, who believe that separation. And unfortunately, in believing it, they do great damage because, well, anyway, we can get on that in another as we move along further. I would say that ethical criteria can be analysed objectively. Now, again, this is an issue which is becoming controversial. Okay? It's controversial in our culture. It's controversial within Christianity in general. And unfortunately now, it's becoming controversial within the Holy Catholic Church. And I find that a little bit creepy. I'd like to be doing these presentations maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when the idea of the Catholic Church changing its moral laws was not something which looked to be staring us in the face. So it's a kind of concern. But what I will say is that I believe, maybe that's just my preference, that Catholic thought up until the present, certainly in the last half century or so, has been based on the idea that ethics are something that can be understood objectively, and they grow by adding to the fundamental corpus of understanding rather than by sort of radical revolutionary changes. So they're the assumptions that we're going to be bringing in to these observations. Applying that to property, we'll say that ultimately property, at least conceptually therefore, should be able to be understood using objective ethical criteria. So that's kind of the challenge. Okay, we've got the puzzle, that's a convention, and now we're making this argument that conventions ultimately lead us into ethics, and we can, one way or another, get to some objective principles to test how they're going. Let's look at property. We use the expression property a lot, especially in economics and our day-to-day business world. And this big question of is private property illicit? We look at the property section in the real estate, in the Sydney Morning Herald, that sort of thing. We use that expression often. However, it's curious because you don't have to go into deep etymology and so on, but the word property comes from philosophy. Doesn't come from economics, doesn't come from real estate. And the word property in philosophy is a property is an attribute that a thing has in order to be itself. So for me to be myself, I have to be a mammal. That's a property of human beings. You don't find any amphibian humans yet. And so it's a attribute that a thing has to have in order to be itself. That's, I guess, fancy metaphysics talk. And as an example, a property of water is that it boils 100 degrees Celsius at sea level and standard pressure. Okay? So if I find something that boils at 70 degrees Celsius, it might look like water. It might be methylated spirits, colourless kind of liquid and all the rest of it. But it doesn't have something which water must have in order to be itself, which is that quality of boiling at 100 degrees Celsius, unless you're on top of Kosciuszko or something. Okay. For the scientists amongst us. That idea of this necessary connection, which is what property infers, is kind of significant here. Because now we can then get to the next question, is that what is the correct way of understanding the property that humans have? I think most of us, will be comfortable that the fingers and toes I've been talking about over and over again are certainly properties of the human person. The fact that we sort of, pop out male and female, that's a property, something that we must have in order to be us. And sure enough, you might find somebody who might be born with 6 toes or something, and that sort of happens occasionally. But the norm, the essence of being human, is all of these things. They're the properties. The important properties, I think, for humanity that I want to look at here is that we need access to the material world in order to have our life sustained. Okay. But the other thing is that means then access ultimately to space. Our conclusion then is that property assets are not proper or necessary for humans. We need access, like the baby sort of coming out and wanting to breathe, needs to be able to breathe, but it doesn't need this piece of air or that piece of air. Do I need to farm on this property or that property? Do I have to live here or there? Not really that important. I need to have access to some space, but not necessarily to any particular space. See the kind of distinction there? So our relationship is different. For convenience, property exists this convention between persons regarding the use of land assets. Now here I'm particularly looking at land property as a distinction between the fingers and toes. So when I'm talking about land, by the way, I'm getting us to think about not simply dirt, but also all of those things which are in creation around us which don't come from the human person. Okay? Like air is a good example. So air is, in this broader idea, part of the land. It's part of God's creation, which is separate to humanity, that I kind of need. And in all cases, it's not natural, it's only conventional. And it is a function of human society. Now this starts to make our initial assumption that we agree with private property a little bit problematic. Because now we're starting to see that, at least philosophically, land ownership is not property. We use the word property, which kind of gives a kind of like an illusion of something which we must have in order to be ourselves. But realistically, it's not quite that strong. Yeah? So now we need to move into looking at some connections. Okay, we'll do some observations about what it is to be human. Now we said the fingers and toes, but really looking at the fact of life is really important. We have a right to life, and to a certain extent, and I won't go into this right now, we have a right to some socially appropriate fulfillment. Okay? I might think I'll be fulfilled if I live like a king, which might mean you guys will have to be my slaves. I don't have a right to that. But as a group, as a society, we have a right to a common quality of life, which is the best the community can have, somehow balanced in terms of relative contribution. So if I'm a bit of a layabout and you're kind of working really hard, then there is a right to you living better than me, but not necessarily for me to starve to death. So I've got to kind of work that out as we go along. Now, what would that suggest? We've already getting into the idea that we have an inalienable right to life already. That's natural. We have a right to the fruits of our labour. We've got to see what exactly that is, because to a certain extent that's not necessarily unlimited. Okay? For instance, if I labour by perhaps inventing something useful, might be a little pill that might put 30 years onto your life. And let's imagine I kind of go out and I work out how to do it. In a sense, by giving you that pill, I'm giving you an extra, 30% onto your life or something. I don't know. Right? It's kind of very valuable to you. If it turns out that I can just go into my backyard and, do something very, very simple to go and make that pill, I've got a really big question as to whether I'm being reasonable by charging you a king's ransom to actually sort of take that thing. Yeah? And so this is where this idea of I have a right to my own labour, that's true, but when I use it to exploit your right in some sense of community to some level of fulfilment, then that becomes a little bit more complicated. Because I have a right to things like air and water and whatnot to keep alive, I have an inalienable right to access to land resources. Now by that I mean the air, the water, and one way or another I need the space in order to live. Now, imagine if you said, okay then, in order to live you're going to have to pay a king's ransom just to go and stand in this spot or sit in that chair. Right? And the only alternative really is to sort of float away or something, right? Which you can't do. So in a sense you need some space somewhere. That's really what I'm getting to think about. And I think we've kind of gone through most of the ideas in here already. We are born needing access to the land and its products. We need access to the resources for life with no private connection to the land assets, right? And so we've got this complication. We have the need to be able to have access to things and not have that denied from us. Then we get some other aspects, and that is that humans are sort of critters that if we simply have unrestricted access to everything, we go only as far as saying, well, I have a natural right to access to the land, to drink the water, breathe the air, maybe sort of live on a particular piece of dirt or maybe sort of plant or what have you, then we'll often have some of the problems with human frailty. I might mess up the part where you want to sleep, and you might sort of tread on the seeds that I've kind of grown, which is going to be my dinner sort of in 6 months' time. Right? And so in a sense we've got this human problem that we tend to look after things more responsibly when we actually can allocate our relationships to them specifically. Yeah? So you don't sort of mess here, and you don't walk there, and somebody else won't walk again on your spot, so that then you're able to sort of flourish. Right? So there's a conventional need to demarcate the land in order to just avoid these unfortunate things that sort of humans tend to do, because we do tend to be more responsible, more productive when we've got something ourselves. We also tend to abuse what is not privately owned. And that's just fact of life. It'd be nice to say we're all going to be sort of saints, but it's not quite that simple. Right? And so these are, if you like, attributes of fallen human nature. We look at the top few characteristics there, the need to have access to the air and the water. We can say, in a sense, those attributes, those top ones, really point us towards the necessity for the things of creation not to be so radically, so strongly privately owned that we could be excluded from them. Imagine if someone came along to you and said, well, how's your MasterCard looking? Because it looks like you're just about running out of air, and I'll sell you a bit more. Or something like that. There's that potential for abuse. There's this need for some level of common use. We haven't quite got to defining it, but we can see that there is a way in which there is need for some common use amongst those things which are not naturally connected to. Then we look at these bottom ones, and those bottom ones all argue towards the importance, the practical importance for the way that humans are, as in our current state, for having private property. And so we've got actually almost like a Janus kind of situation. We've got this two-faced approach to property. We've got good reasons coming from human nature that say property should not be completely privately owned. And we've also got good reasons, again, coming from the human condition as we experience it, that say it should be privately owned. Yeah? That's a bit of a worry. Because we've got this tension between these ideas. The conclusion, or if you like, the answer to that puzzle, common use, or private ownership, is that when we look at the nature of how we are, what we are, we see that there's this tension, but it means that we need this two-sided solution, ownership linked with obligation. And that's like a common combination when we look at the way that different cultures have used land over the years. And to do that, I'm just going to look at some historical cases. In the early Greek period, this is Greece up to about the 5th century BC, property was generally understood as something that was a family treasure. Okay? Families would own it. I think we did a bit of this on the first night. Okay, we're going to take this or at least the specific aspect of it a little bit further now. That for the Greeks, a family would own the property, and it was for the use of the family, but it was privately owned by the family. So there's this kind of private aspect to it, but there's also a common entitlement. Also in the early Greek families, the family was understood to be something a lot bigger than what we're familiar with. So it would be the sisters, the cousins, the aunts, the grandparents, all the other sort of distant relatives and so on, all part of the clan. You know, if you could identify yourself as a blood relative, you'd be, in one way or another, able to benefit. You still see that to a certain extent in some cultures today. Okay, so if you go to various parts, especially the older cultures, the ones that haven't been too messed around by modernity, you'll still find that broad idea of the family, and to a certain extent that broader understanding of what property means. The early Greeks really used property virtually for the benefit of a social collective. So now it's starting to look a bit scary because the early Greeks are starting to look like socialists. The other side of the Greek situation was that the person understood themselves, defined themselves in relationship to the family, to the clan, to the tribe. And so I would think of myself as a good person, or I'd sort of, be proud of my achievements, largely to the extent that my achievements fitted into the flourishing of my family. And likewise, I would see myself as valued amongst, the rest of the world very highly on what my family did. And so if I had a brother or an uncle or what have you who was a bit of a rogue, I'd be humiliated. Or if I had a relative who was, some great achiever, Alexander the Great or something, I think, oh, this is marvellous, right? There's this kind of distance that our culture is largely losing. We tend to think, well, yeah, I've got sort of, a brother-in-law who's a bit of a rat bag, but who cares? Got nothing to do with me. Right? That wasn't something that was a case in the early Greek thought. It was changing around the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Certainly by the time you get to Aristotle, it was getting very common that Greece was becoming urbanized. And to economically power the cities, a new form of property right had to be developed, partly because in cities, the people can't feed themselves out of their backyard. If you're living in the country, you can, because your backyard is your farm, right? And so when people moved into Athens and the other sort of great Greek cities, you need to have people owning property that they weren't connected with in the traditional family kind of a way, that was able to give them the economic resources to be able to swan around and write poetry and talk philosophy and paint pictures and all the other things that the classical Greeks were able to do. And so to a certain extent, part of the story of the rise of the Greek cities and the Greek culture was a new form of property. And Aristotle came along at a point where there was this tension between the old form of property and the new form of property, especially since the new form of property actually brought in a number of, unfortunate kind of results. Okay, we'll talk about that as we go along. Aristotle tried to resolve it, and he gave us what's known now as Aristotle's theory on property. It's got a special name which will become apparent when I introduce it completely. Aristotle saw there was the family tenure, which is the old one. He saw the city individual tenure. And he came up with what now is called Aristotle's dual theory of property. And Aristotle's dual theory of property is that property should have private ownership with common use. And that's now a term which has actually been adopted, and I'll go on to the next slide, as we get one of my patrons came along many years later, and he said that property is a convention. And it's worth your while reading this if you're interested in following this up. Go into the Summa. It's the second part of the second part. Question 66, I think. Private property. Read it yourself. It's not very difficult. It's really worth looking at because he plugs the idea private property is a convention. Private property is effectively managed when it's privately owned, St. Thomas tells us. And he gives us some lovely examples, very succinctly in the way that St. Thomas writes, about why we need private ownership. And he sort of talks about the fallen condition of humanity and that sort of thing. But he also notes it's not natural, it's conventional. But then he says, property is naturally common. A little concept that St. Thomas definitely sort of plugged is that in heaven there won't be any private property. Now that kind of upsets a lot of right-wingers. Say, whoa, we need private property, it's part of the Catholic law, all sort of. Yeah, that's true. It's necessary on earth. In heaven, we will have a material environment, after resurrection and all that stuff. But because we won't have human frailty, we won't need private property, because the reasons we need private property have to do with our original sin, our laziness, our greed, and those kind of things. But on earth, private property is necessary and naturally, but it doesn't take away from the way that property is naturally common. And so what do we have? St. Thomas would say that privatisation of common property is licit so long as the person who takes those property rights doesn't disadvantage the poor man. And again, it's kind of worth your while reading it. So it gives us a complex, nuanced perhaps, theory of property, which has now got this dual kind of character. And we can certainly trace this back to the nature of humanity and the nature of our relationship with the created world. We move along to St. Bonaventure. St. Bonaventure's great. You see St. Bonaventure in the writings, or at least some of the writings of Pope Benedict XVI, and especially his contribution to Catholic social thought, where he really focuses primarily on gift and love as the dynamics behind the economy. And that's something which is really anathema for most people. What does St. Bonaventure do? He was, contemporary of St. Thomas Aquinas. He was of the opinion, he knew that it is hard to treat your brother justly if you don't first love him. Now, it's one thing for us to talk a lot about justice, and a lot of people get really excited about justice, especially when they get a bit politically savvy. And it's justice, justice, justice. Somehow as though there's this kind of this hammer of justice that you're able to knock people around the head with. Okay? What St. Bonaventure is telling you is that justice is actually kind of a gift. It comes from love. To treat somebody justly is something that you tend to do to the people that you care for. It's a sign of care. Because in a sense, injustice is something that comes because of the abuse of some power that I have. Right? If I have a power over you, I might be trying to fool you tonight. Right? I have the power. I look like I'm some clever bloke, and I think, I'm going to sort of, really sort of twist their heads around, right? And you trust me. That trust, again, gives me a kind of power. Now, if I care for you, at least to a little amount, I love you, to use the Christian understanding in St. Bonaventure, I'm not going to abuse my power. Right? I'm going to treat you justly. I'm going to communicate to you the truth as I understand it, right? Which is keeping the proportion between us as humans, which I think is the objective foundation for why telling fibs is not a good idea. Okay, so that's the principle. It starts off. You see, he's coming from love. It's kind of curious because Thomas Aquinas tends to work from metaphysics, from material stuff, what it is to be. Right? St. Bonaventure, he works his arguments, his understanding, his philosophy, his theology, his morals, more from an understanding of the fundamental reality of love, which is kind of lovely. I found it. I've got a bit of an engineering background, so I was far closer to St. Thomas first of all. But after a while, this stuff really sort of takes over. It's really, really powerful, but it can be abused. If the world is a gift from God, who loves humanity, property is a loan from God that should be used really for God's purposes. So when I own land, in one way or another, it's on loan from God. Right? If I've got an idea that I want to end up in heaven, I better use the land the way the boss wants me to, because at some point I'm going to have to stare him face to face, nose to nose, and give an account of that. And he's going to say, look, I made you a rich man. I gave you that economic power, that property, that land property. Right? Have you used it for my purposes? Have you used it in a way which gives me a bit of a clue that you deserve to be in heaven? Because in heaven, people are going to be following my way, happily and freely and all the rest of it. Oh, that's scary. It's really beautiful. It's scary. So where do you get from Bonaventure? So from St. Bonaventure comes the idea that God permits private property. He permits it because of our fallen nature. And anyway, if we were perfect, we wouldn't have a problem with private property, because we tend to be using it as a way of loving other people as well. Yeah. So he permits it, and we certainly need it in our fallen state. Our reason for existence is to grow in conformity to the loving God. Okay. Why did God make us? Know, love and serve him in this life and be with him forever in the next. Yeah. So in a sense, our property ownership, our private property, is kind of like a warm-up. It's a practice session to get us ready for heaven. Now this puts real estate into a completely different plane. An exciting plane when you start to see it in these terms, but certainly not the way that you'd normally come across it in Economics 101, especially when the economists are telling you that there's no moral overhead in economics. Okay, again, what happens? When we put St. Bonaventure's thinking together, God permits private property, so private ownership is in there, and our reason for existence leads, one way or another, using our private property rights in some way for the common good. For our good, certainly, but also for the good of those around us, those who are connected to us in some way. Not necessarily just our family like the ancient Greeks, but the community in general. And you see, the genius of Christianity is that unlike a tribal religion, which is like a local religion, and ultimately Judaism was a tribal religion, and you still see a lot of tribal religions around the world today, the Aborigines and indigenous people in various places, they have animist religions which are very important for them and often very, very civilizing, but they're only local. Whereas Christianity and a couple of other religions can make the claim to be world religions, because it's a universal brotherhood that we're looking at, not simply a tribal brotherhood, the way that it would be, say, in the Middle East amongst, Muslim tribes and whatnot. Although Islam itself is a world religion, it reaches out to people all over the world. Okay, the point about this, though, is that both St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas, using very different methods, come to the same conclusion. They come to the conclusion with the understanding, the illumination of the gospel. But it's not a different understanding to what you get from Aristotle, who used pure reason and observation to come to his conclusions. Reason, observation, and to give him his due, Aristotle used good, sound metaphysics. So kind of three ways of getting the same answer. And it's always this complexity of the dual theory, and we'll stay with that term. Let's look at where that went. You see, this idea of private ownership with common use, you can interpret different political economic systems and see either it's there or it's not. If we apply it to the way that property was administered at the time of really the peak of Christianity, around that period between 800 and about 1400, what we can see is this dual theory of property was actually alive and well within the feudal system. Because in the feudal system, ultimately the king was the private owner of all of the land in the realm, but he had the moral obligation under God to use that property wealth for the good of the community. And so the king would supply law and order, defence, and a certain amount of civil infrastructure, like roads and bridges and that sort of stuff. Right? And so the feudal system works very well as an example of private ownership with common use. And it was pretty much unassailed. However, by the time you get to the end of the medieval period, around, it was happening in the 1400s, certainly by the time you get into the 1500s, the wheels fell off big time. And we come into modernity. We find that modernity is largely determined by an attitude to property, a theory of property, which is not private ownership with common use. So many things in modernity have to do with taking some combination of apparent opposites, and instead of joining them with an and, join them with an or. And so whereas the Catholic understanding, the Aristotelian understanding was private ownership with common use, private ownership and common use, the moderns came along and said, oh, I'm not sure which it should be. Is it private ownership or common use? And in the early modern period, that question, when they put the or in, turned it into a question, was to go for the private ownership. Well, we had private ownership. Private ownership suits me. I'm kind of wealthy and economically and maybe intellectually powerful in my community, and I'm only that because I've got private property. Therefore, I definitely like the idea of private property. And so very early in modernity, you had this adoption of what was referred to as absolute private property. The previous approach that we're looking at, we could call, well, it's a dual theory of property we've been calling it, but also conditional private property. And so we go from conditional private property, so in other words, we've got the condition of common ownership, common use with our property, to this radical, extreme, absolute private property. That's what really determined, that's the watershed. So it was starting to gather steam in the 1400s, time to get in the 1500s, very, very apparent. Certainly, say in England, Henry VIII got his political support by sacking the monasteries, taking their land, and giving it privately without obligation to his mates, who kind of helped support him. And you find that kind of a story on the continent as well, and it was largely behind a fair bit of the support that Luther and Calvin had. And so this sort of change in religion that happened then had a property dimension to it. Okay, so I'm saying that modernity is marked by the ascendancy of radical private property, the removal of the obligations. So no longer was it ownership with obligations, it was simply ownership. It was radically absolute. You also found, parallel to that, commercial individualism. Now, we're going to be sort of talking about that later on when we're looking at trade and price and things like that. But these two things, in fact, all three of the major economic moral principles were violated as we moved into modernity. So the first one was property went to be private. The second one was let the buyer beware in trade. And I won't even start to sort of talk about that, but we'll be talking about that later on. And then we sort of end up with the problems of money as well. Problems. Well, it's one thing to say, I like having my private property and I like not having my community obligations because I'm wealthier, it's just more comfortable. Okay? But then in order not to have what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, I have to have a reason, I have to have a story, I have to have an excuse. I have to have a theory of radical private property. And this started to be a game or a pursuit which you find started pretty much in the 16th century, and it continued as we went along. Closely related question comes kind of indirectly, but if you've got ownership with obligation, the private value of land is balanced by the obligations. So oddly enough, the question of property values, you'd never have a property value back in the 1300s. It just couldn't happen because land didn't trade, it didn't have a sale price, and even the rents tended to be sort of balanced by all these complex sort of social kind of relationships. Right? But once you had radical private property, you actually had the question of how do you compute the land rents. And I'll just go through a couple of these and then we'll finish up for this evening. I want to just give you a flavour for the way that the early moderns thought as we go along. One of the early political economists, the early economists, if you like, is a chap by the name of William Petty, an Englishman. And Petty wanted to look at this question of how do you justify the value of land, the value of land rent, which is really the first question. And Petty recognised that there was a tension between land and labour. Okay, just think of it this way. If I own a block of land and you're a farmer and I'm renting you my block of land, right, what is the balance? You go and do all the work, you plant the corn and all the rest of it, the corn crop grows up. Where do we draw the line in terms of what percentage of the crop goes to me as rent as opposed to you to feed your family and do whatever else you need to do to keep the farm going, right? Because there's no natural line there, okay? And we talk about supply and demand and all that sort of stuff, and we'll talk about those things another time. You see that the question about land rent becomes really, really important. It's a simple farming community. It's as simple as that. That if, for whatever reason, you can't go anywhere else as a farmer, I can charge you maybe 90% of your crop. So I get really wealthy. I just sit back, don't do any work. You just kind of feed me all the time. Right? You're working like a dog, and your kids are starving. How do we set that balance? Right? If you think about it a little bit, you'll see there is actually no natural answer to it. And so Petty came along and said, well, how do you actually do that? Petty came along with the idea of what he called the par, and that was the relative price of rent to labour. And so he could see that land rent had to be somehow denominated in labour value. He thought that land rent kind of came first. There's a little bit of a techo stuff that I won't worry about going on to. But this last point is important. What Petty noticed, he said, well, if I've got a block of land which is worth, 100 bags of gold, and I can get, 5% on my 100 bags of gold, well, if the block of land is there, I should be able to get 5% on the value of the land. Right? So if the land's worth 100 bags of gold, and I'm getting 5%, that means I'm getting 5 bags of gold per year in interest. And if the land is worth 100 bags of gold, then I should get 5 bags of gold as rent. And he said, well, that's kind of a fair way of doing it because land is valuable, money is valuable, and so it's a nice kind of answer. So that kind of looks like a nice answer because it does solve this problem of how much of the corn crop you actually come home as the landowner. It actually foreshadows modern finance theory, and you might have come across CAPM. It's a finance acronym. Anyway, I won't go into it right now. But basically, Petty is kind of setting the groundwork for something which comes to us at present. We're actually going to come back when we talk about money and the problem of usury. But the big problem is that later on we're going to discover we've got this massive problem as to whether the 5 bags of gold interest on the 100 bags of gold interest loan is in fact moral itself. And if it turns out that charging the 5 bags of gold as interest on the loan, money loan, is immoral, sends you to hell, mortal sin, then there goes my theory of land rent. So William Petty's idea identifies a practical issue, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. Now we get to Hugo Grotius. Grotius, I think, was sort of like came from Denmark, Sweden, kind of around that end of the world. He's considered to be the father of modern natural law theory. And it's one of the things which is kind of interesting. I mean, I know you guys would probably be, schooled to have respect for natural law. But one of the things you've got to be a little bit careful of is there's natural laws and natural laws, at least in terms of natural law theory. And I would say that some of the stuff which is, masquerading around as natural law theory, which is often touted as pretty leading edge, wonderful, conservative, Catholic natural law theory, I think is actually quite modern and extremely dangerous. And so we can just look at Grotius for just a moment, because he's considered to be, a natural law theorist. Right? So he's saying, I'm going to give you a natural reason why we should have absolute private property. So it's a natural reason, and it leads to absolute private property, which is exactly what the moderns want. So remember, the problem is they don't want ownership with obligation. They want radical private ownership. Grotius argued like this. He said, people must occupy land in order to live. That's kind of pretty obvious. You have to sit in your chair, right? You can't have 3 people sitting in the chair, right? And when you sleep at night, you really like not to have half a dozen people sort of sharing the bed with you, right? Especially if they've got fleas. One way or another, we need our own space for different things. The farmer going out and sowing the crops needs to be able to put a fence around that paddock to say nobody touch that for the next 12 months, because my labour is in there. And you would violate something of me, my labour, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit later when we talk about Locke. Something about me would be violated if I didn't have that space. And likewise, I mean, here we are quite comfortable with the idea that, this is our lounge room, right? You guys are visitors, and that's marvellous. We can give hospitality to you. Now, if we didn't have it as our lounge room, in a sense, we couldn't give you hospitality. Right? And the same with bathrooms and kitchens and all the other parts of the land we know. So the point about it is that people must occupy land in order to live. By occupying land, they exclude others from it. Okay, you can't have somebody else sitting in your seat while you're sitting in it. And so the very fact that you need that, and it's a natural part of, being a mortal human person, which is, natural, human nature and all that sort of stuff, you're actually keeping people out of some bit of space. And so from that, it's fairly easy to move through. Therefore, ergo, land property is a natural consequence of living. That's Grotius's natural law theory of absolute private property. Okay, now that looks pretty impressive, and in fact, if you read property theory books, you'll say, well, Grotius has done it. He's just kind of shown us that we've got a natural right to absolute private property, because there's no sharing when it comes to you sitting in your chair, and there's no need to, and it'd be improper to. So, absolute private property. However, we need to look at it a little bit deeper. Okay. Now, I don't want to go too far into this because I'll sort of wind this up shortly. But we have to ask ourselves, is occupation the same as ownership? And is my need for private occupation the same as arguing for me to own it radically without any obligations to anybody else? Get the idea? So right now you're occupying the chair. I don't think it'll trouble you that later on you may not be. No? And somebody else might occupy it. The fact that you occupied it, does that mean that you've then got a property right over it, that you're going to be able to use that to, charge rent against somebody else? Right? And so that then becomes a bit of an issue, you see. Certainly I do need that space, but it's not necessarily kind of fixed. What we're going to be seeing, and next time we get together we might look at some of these other theories, what we're going to be seeing is that the real interest in property, the people that really get excited about owning property, actually don't want it for themselves. The people I was telling you about from Henry VIII's time that were given the monastery lands because they kicked out the monks or, hung them or whatever they did with them, they didn't want to live on the land. They were nobles. They didn't want to be out there, ploughing in dirt and sort of, playing with horse dung and stuff to go and sort of fertilise the place, right? They got other people to do that. So how does that fit with Grotius? Actually not very well at all. Because the people that are actually occupying the land that Henry sort of gave his mates weren't the people that had the property rights to it. In fact, the people who were occupying it were precisely the people who didn't have property rights. And that's what made Henry's mates wealthy. Get the idea? Right? And so while Grotius is kind of sounds like a good story, and to a certain extent it kind of holds water to a certain extent, in terms of saying, yes, we do need private space or the individual allocation of land. In fact, for the real economic stuff of private property, it actually doesn't go anywhere at all. Okay. Hopefully what we've done tonight is introduce you to the puzzle of private property and the complexity of it. And I think we're starting to see the way that it's very, very important for economic relations. While we've been using agricultural examples, we could very easily take this into an advanced industrial economy and come up with the same things. And eventually I hope to be able to do a bit of that. But we can see that there is a moral dimension to it. And it's not nearly as easy to prove, to philosophically, argue conclusively, objectively, that the idea of private property is as easy as it looks, right? The church, by the way, right up until the present, in fact, even today, it formally stands behind the notion of private ownership with common use. And right now, that's one of the really, really big sort of arguments, if you like, amongst the church, where you've got people that, probably cruel to say, call themselves Catholics, that are basically rejecting that idea in favour of absolute private property and are trying to tell the Pope that he doesn't know what he's saying when he basically continues this tradition which goes back not just through Christian history, like to St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure and so on, but right back to Aristotle. Okay? And another time what we'll look at is the way that respecting private ownership with common use actually gives you a stronger economy. I think that's enough for tonight.